Imagine being a respected judge cruising through your own neighborhood, only to be pulled over by a police officer who suspects you've stolen your own car. You're forced to stand there, powerless, despite your reputation, your title, and everything you've achieved. What happens when the truth finally comes out, and the officer realizes who you really are? The late afternoon sun bathed the stately homes of Redwood Grove in a warm glow. Each house stood behind manicured hedges and quiet streets, far removed from the bustle of city life. At the wheel of a brand-new black sedan sat Judge James Howard, a prominent figure in the legal world of Mayfield County. With a day of back-to-back hearings behind him, he was ready to unwind during the short drive to his home. Judge Howard took a calming breath, the hum of the car engine and the distant chirping of birds lulling him into rare relaxation. His phone, set to silent, glowed with an onslaught of missed notifications. But for a moment, he could forget the weight of the gavel and enjoy this peaceful neighborhood where he'd lived for years. That serenity shattered when flashing blue lights pierced his rearview mirror. "No way I'm speeding," he mumbled, double-checking the odometer. The needle sat well below the speed limit. Carefully, Judge Howard pulled to the curb, rolled down his window, and waited. In his court, he was used to commanding respect. On the roadside, however, he was just another driver, at least to the patrol officer exiting the squad car. Through the side mirror, Judge Howard saw a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a crisp uniform approaching. Something in the officer's posture felt tense. "License and registration," the officer demanded, tapping on the window frame. There was no greeting, no explanation, just an immediate, clipped tone. "Yes, officer," Judge Howard replied, controlling his voice as he reached for the glove compartment. He'd been pulled over a few times in his life, like any other driver. But something in this officer's tone tightened the knot in his stomach. Once the officer had James Howard's license, he gave it a cursory glance. His eyes flicked from the ID photo to the real man seated in front of him. "Step out of the car." James blinked. He'd never been asked to exit the vehicle so abruptly, especially not in his own neighborhood. "May I ask what this is about?" he said, carefully modulating his tone. "Car theft has been on the rise around here," the officer snapped. "This vehicle matches a description from last week." Judge Howard's heart sank. He thought of all the cases he'd presided over regarding racial profiling, yet here he was, experiencing the same bias. "Sir, I'm Judge Howard. I can show you—" But the officer waved his hand dismissively. "I don't care who you say you are. Now step out of the vehicle." The hostility in the officer's voice unsettled James. Still, he complied, opening the door slowly so as not to escalate the situation. Standing on the sidewalk under the watchful gaze of a uniformed figure with one hand resting on his holster made him feel strangely vulnerable. "Hands on the hood," the officer barked. James's jaw tightened. He wanted to protest, to snap that he was a judge and a longtime homeowner in this very area. But he also knew how easily an encounter like this could spiral. The slow trickle of humiliation began as neighbors peered through windows and parted curtains. He placed his hands on the warm hood, feeling anger and disbelief surge in his chest. How often had he presided over cases of unfair stops or unwarranted searches? Wasn't that something he'd dedicated his life to rectifying? As the officer patted him down, James forced himself to remain calm. This was the prejudice people spoke of in his courtroom, this gut-churning, powerless feeling. And if it could happen to him, a figure of authority, how often did it happen to those with less privilege? "Officer," he managed, "I can provide further proof this is my car. The lease is inside. I purchased it from—" "I said quiet," the officer cut in. His expression suggested he didn't believe a word. "You match a suspect's description. We'll see what dispatch says." A flicker of panic ignited in James's chest. "Please run my plates," he insisted. "You'll see it's registered to me. I live right here in Redwood Grove." But the officer already had his radio in hand, speaking in hushed tones. James could only hope the truth would come swiftly. After a tense minute, the radio crackled back, though the officer's grip on James's arm didn't loosen. Another voice came through. "Confirm name. James Howard?" "Wait, Judge James Howard? Is that correct?" Hearing that, the officer stiffened. An awkward pause stretched between them like a taut rope. Finally, the officer let go of James's arm but glared down at him, refusing to acknowledge the name's significance. "Officer Kaplan," the radio squawked again. "You need to stand down. He's who he says he is. Return the license immediately." Kaplan's face flushed. He let out a tense breath, stepping back from James. "All right, show me your ID again." By now, James's frustration outweighed his desire to keep the peace. He rummaged for his official ID, pulling out the credentials that certified him as Judge Howard of the Mayfield County Superior Court. Kaplan's eyes widened ever so slightly. "Judge, I apologize for the inconvenience. We've had a spree of thefts." "You assumed I fit that description," James said quietly, his voice tight. "Do you realize how often this happens to people who don't have a title to protect them?" Kaplan's gaze flicked around the street. Neighbors were staring more openly now. Some had stepped onto their lawns, phones in hand. If the officer had any arrogance left, it was draining fast. Just then, a second patrol car arrived, squealing to a stop behind the first. A senior officer emerged, Lieutenant Harris, who recognized Judge Howard instantly. "Judge, are you all right?" Harris called, striding forward with visible concern. "Officer Kaplan, why is Judge Howard out of his vehicle?" James exhaled slowly, retrieving his license from Kaplan's outstretched hand. "I'm fine, Lieutenant. But this shouldn't have happened." Harris's expression darkened. "This is a misunderstanding, sir. We'll handle it." Then, turning on Kaplan, he added in a low voice, "You messed up big time." The younger officer stood at attention, eyes downcast. James straightened his jacket, trying to quell the swirl of emotion. He was furious, embarrassed, and oddly relieved. "A misunderstanding is putting it lightly," he said, addressing both officers. "I'm not going to pretend this never happened." Lieutenant Harris nodded, lips pressed into a tight line. "Of course, sir. We'll conduct a full review. I sincerely hope you'll accept the department's apologies." But an apology alone wouldn't fix the deeper issue. James had spent years on the bench, hearing countless stories of discrimination. This was living proof it needed to be addressed from within the system. In the ensuing days, the incident went viral on local social media. Neighbors shared cell phone footage of the judge, pinned against his own vehicle, and opinions flooded in. Some were outraged, others defended Officer Kaplan's caution. But the result was undeniable. Redwood Grove and Mayfield County had an overdue conversation on the horizon. At a special press conference, Lieutenant Harris stood beside James Howard, publicly apologizing on behalf of the department and promising reforms. Officer Kaplan looked on from the crowd, his stance rigid and uneasy. He later approached James privately, struggling to articulate his remorse. I understand if you can't forgive me," Kaplan began. "I made a rash judgment. I let my assumptions get in the way." "You did," James said, not unkindly. "But I don't want your career ruined. I want your perspective changed. You and the department need to fix what's broken, so this doesn't happen to anyone else." Kaplan nodded slowly, genuinely chastened. I'm willing to learn." In the weeks that followed, the local police force introduced implicit bias training, community outreach programs, and roundtable discussions with legal professionals, including Judge Howard. While no single measure could dissolve every prejudice, the changes were tangible steps forward. For James, life gradually returned to normal, court sessions and late-night research. Yet something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer content to rule from the bench without pushing for broader systemic reform. If the law was truly blind, then it must apply equally in routine encounters, on the streets, in the neighborhoods, for everyone. Late one evening, Judge Howard found himself driving home again along that same quiet road. He caught sight of a patrol car in the rearview mirror. His pulse jumped, just for a second. But this time, the cruiser passed him without stopping. As it receded into the night, James gripped the wheel, thankful that maybe, just maybe, Redwood Grove was learning. He let out a steady breath. No one should be forced to prove their worth because of an unspoken bias. If a highly respected judge could be treated like a thief, countless others endured even worse. But small steps toward justice were, at least, steps in the right direction.